If you are right on the ball and you're tuning in lickety split, I'm just getting my laptop up to speed so I can watch for comments. All right, better make it bigger. There we go. All right. So when someone tunes in, if they will let me know if you can hear me, that would be spectacular. Let's see, it will. Perfection. All right. Always a little bit delayed, but that will help. I'm going to grab one other thing. What am I looking for? I'm looking for some stuff to share with you guys, but it's hiding. About the earth tones. See if I can find it. Sorry, I'm still here. I'm looking. Maybe. Oh, I think I found it. All right. So I'll go ahead and get started, knowing that people will tune in when they are available and that others can watch it on replay. So I was trying to think of what we could do a little bit different than the stuff I've done in the past. And we get the request a lot about the earth tones, or no, sorry, about scene work. So this is not a complicated scene. This is actually a very simple scene. And we've done ones like this before. So this is not super complex. I think what I need from people who are watching is some specifics about what you want in a scene. Do you want trees? Do you want water? I'd rather have a little focus versus just color a scene. That doesn't tell me what you really want to learn how to draw or how to create. So let's see. Oh, Carla's text messaging me at the moment. Let's see. What am I doing? I'm answering her. She's going to laugh when she realizes that I'm answering her in the middle of teaching. All right. But so I'm doing a really simple scene this time. Sorry, distracted easily. But the other thing I thought I would talk a little bit about, which I haven't done on Kraftin Kimmie specifically, is about working with earth tones, but then also talking a little bit about shape and creating shape with Copics. So I thought we'd kind of focus in on that, where the scene is super, super easy. Maybe getting a little more information on those two issues can be helpful. So I'm using the snail mail set. So I've got both of the snails and I've got the little pouch stamped up. And then I'm using almost all earth tones. The only non-earth tones I'm using are for the scene itself. So on the ground and in the sky. But the rest of it is going to be all earth tones. So the snail, the pouch, and this other guy, all those are different earth tone groups. So if you ever have the chance to look at the newer version of the Copic color chart, I think this will all fit in there. This is what the newest version looks like. They've gone through variations, but this is what the newest version looks like. And like a standard color wheel, usually the red's kind of at the top. You work your way around yellow, reds, yellows, yellow, greens, greens, blue, greens, blues, blue, violets, violets, red, violets, back up to red. So all of the Copic color families are on here, but then the neutrals have to find a new home. So they put all the grays in the center. You've got your warms, your toners, your neutrals, and your cools. You've got your fluorescents, and you've got your black and your colorless blender. And then the earth tones. They're sitting quietly over here. And the reason for that is they don't sit on a standard color wheel. Browns do not. That's not part of this color wheel. So it's not sitting across from something being its complementary. It's not sitting at an angle from something being an analogous. And those are all art terms for the relationship on the color wheel. The earth tones are off in their own little world, as are the grays, the fluorescents. Those don't fit in there. With that being said, they also do not fit with the general rules of the Copic numbering system. So on our Copics, the numbers, hey everybody. So the Copic numbering system, we talk about the letters mean the color family, that first number, and then the second, or the first letters are the color family. So on a BV, it's blue violet, and that's the color family. And then the first number that's right up against those letters is the saturation number. And that means how much gray is in the marker. So how much has been added to the color. The last number is the value, which is the light and the dark. So one that has a really low number is going to be a really light color. The one that really has a high number is going to be a dark number. But that first number, that gray, again, if it's really, really low, that means very little, or if it even starts with a 0, there's no gray added. If it gets higher, we've got some gray added and more as it gets higher. So that's how the color numbering system works in the Copic world, except for all the exceptions. And one of those exceptions is all of these earth tone markers. They're sitting off to the side because not only do they not fit on a standard color wheel in any world, in any artistic world, but they also don't fit in the numbering system. So they're all labeled with an E, which is the earth tone family, but then that first number is not a saturation number. The last number is a value number, but again, the first number does not fit by those rules. So a really easy way to look at that, and this is not going to fit, I'm going to turn it sideways because it'll almost fit, is the E zeros all fit together, but it doesn't necessarily mean there's 0 gray. The E1s all fit together in a group, but it doesn't mean they have a little bit more gray. And so if you go down the row, and sorry, I've got it turned sideways, it's just so you guys can see it all. These are the 0s, the 1s, the 2s, the 3s, and it looks like it's kind of playing by the rules. And then you get to like the 4s and 5s, and it's like, wait, this gets really gray in those 4s. those 4s turn really gray, and it works great for hair. It gets this really dark brown. The E5s are kind of a funky one, and in the middle of the E5s, you get this funny olive effect. You'll only see it in that E53, E55 range, and it's when you try to blend it. And so when you add more alcohol by blending another, blending back and forth, you get this kind of olive effect underneath, which if people use it for skin tones, it starts making them look like they're going to puke. It's a very nice effect. The E7s actually have this very mauve or purplish undertone to them. The E8s, this is mossy green. To me, you're getting away from brown entirely, but we've got purples, we've got greens, and then you have this beautiful bright terracotta in the E9s. And so to me, that's not adding a bunch of gray. So it really changes with that earth tone. And so you can literally color images with only the earth tones if you've got kind of these different color families. So most of the time, if a person is newer at Copic, I tell them kind of stick within instead of trying to jump between the earth tones, going E0 to E2 to E4 to E5. Stick within that one kind of row. Stick with E0s blending together and E1s and E4s, E7s to start. You can absolutely blend any of them together, but blending an E8 that has this very mossy green tone in with an E7, which has that mauve or purple undertone, is going to be tricky. It's going to be messy when you get those two colors together. So it's not the same as the other colors where sometimes we add that saturation or desaturation, to create more depth. It doesn't work the same in the earth tones. You have to play with it a little bit more, be a little more color savvy, and you can learn it absolutely and experiment with it, play with it off to the side, and they are fun to play with. But quick explanation there. That's like the down and dirty version. As always, you guys have questions. Kim, that's something. So I have a blank version of that. I'm sorry, I'm just coming back and seeing questions. If you're interested, that's something I could share. It's something I share with some of my classes. So if I have a blank of this color chart that then you want to fill out, I might have a small colored version. I could share that as well if that's what you're more interested in. So before we go, you want to hang out and color? Always. You're more than welcome. But we could definitely put the blank or the color one up later if people are interested in seeing more of that. It's also in my Copic 101 class where I talk about that in a little more depth when we go through all of it. So our snails, we're going to color with just earth tones. And so what I did on them is I kind of picked an earth tone group for each of the sections. So this guy, if you can guess, my guess is you can, what I did with him is I did these E9s that have that really bright terracotta, and his shell, look how gray that is. And it has those almost mauve undertones. That actually is the E7s on his shell. And then this little guy, his shell are those E8s. That's that mossy green. And then his body is actually those E5s. It's the lighter end of that scale. So that's what I'm using for this. And then the bag, see those reddish undertones? That's a series of E0s, believe it or not. They go all the way into that really brick red. And so it's kind of cool because they give us this really neat range. A blank, that's what I meant. What about the color chart? Have they done a new one? So Kim, they have a chart that looks like this now. I don't know if they've come out with a blank of it, but this is the newest version of their color wheel. So my guess is it's newer than 2014, I'm guessing. And I do love the E7s. This is another color that if you're looking for something to create shadows, the E7s, because they have that cooler tone to them, even though they're earth tones, they have that much cooler tone, cast shadows and the shadow areas on an object, the E7s actually work really well for that. All right, so let's color up our snails. And while we're doing it, and I'm gonna kind of keep coloring and talking the whole time like normal. While I'm doing it, I'm gonna talk you guys through a little bit what I'm looking for when I'm trying to create shape and create volume on stuff. So that is your art lesson for the day. Okay, so just cutting apart so they're a little bit easier to wrap around. All right, so I'm going to grab my E9s for the front end of this guy and my E5s for my front end of the other guy. So the body of the snail to me is kind of two pieces. His head and then the snail part, which is almost like a slug, kind of a cylinder. So the head is kind of a round ball, at least the way it's been drawn. It's kind of got this bulbous little round head, and then the body itself is more like a cylinder or a tube, and it kind of slides under the shell and out the back end. And so when I'm shading something, it's good to think about light source, but it's even more important to think about what shape it is and what you're trying to create that look of. When people talk about where's my light source, it's more an issue of staying consistent. That's the more important part. So if you want to give yourself, okay, my light source is going to come from over on the left-hand side. It's not so much that you have a direct light, it's that you want to stay consistent about where that light source is coming from. And that's more important for us versus the exact. If you really wanted to make this look realistic, you need photographs and in that shading, in that situation that you're trying to shade it in, and blah, 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 blah. It goes on and on. These are cartoon snails, folks. We're not going to get like photorealism here, which is a-okay. But if we want to make it look like it has form and shape, we're going to do two things. We're going to shade it according to its shape. And number two, we're going to stay consistent. So if he's being lit from overhead, that whole thing is being lit from overhead. We're not going to worry about one side than the other. It just gets lit from overhead. I hope that's somewhat helpful. Okay, so for this little guy, I am going to go from light to dark. So in this case, my E9-3 is my lightest. I am not going to worry about his little spots. They're just going to get colored in for now because I'm going to do the spots slightly darker. And I am going to try to work around his little eyes and leave those white. Now on the card, when I put that together, I actually put glossy accents over the little eyes. So if for some reason I needed to go back at the very end and touch those up with a little bit of opaque white and or some black, I could do that. I try not to, because you can't do any correcting once you've done that. And then the two colors I'm going to use to create that shape are E9-5, which is actually fairly close to the E9-3, and then E9-7, which is a much bigger jump. So let's start with the E9-5. So we've got this round head. So we know we're going to have shading come up from underneath and around from the side. Ooh, this isn't showing up at all, but I remember I needed it to get a nicer blend. And we're going to go up and around the outside with a little antenna. I'm sure that's not what that's called on a slug or a snail. And then I'm going to come in right across this little ridge on the lip to show kind of that little dip and flare out. And it'll come in across and under. It's going to come down his neck and up from the ground up. Now this is all going to show up here better in just a second, so hang in there. When I scoot to my darker color, the E9-7, It goes in the exact same places. It just comes in less. When I'm going from light to dark, as I work into those darker shades, I just use less and less of that color. So it kind of curls up and around and up from the bottom. Because his body is a cylinder, like as it comes down, this top edge is probably going to catch a little light, and this top edge as well. And as it curves around and underneath him, that's where that shadow happens. So these are really simple shapes to shade, which makes them fun, easy to color. And then if you're going light to dark, you hit reverse and go back through your colors. And this is where that E95, even though it's really, really similar, comes in handy, because it makes that blend happen super easy. That being said, I've done a lot of blending, jumping from my E93, which is what I have in my hand now, all the way to that E97. So is it possible? Absolutely. It's not a huge range in the E9s. So that gives me that kind of round head, and it gives me kind of that rounded body. And for the most part, it's just lit from straight above. All right, scooting over. And if you were ever curious, this is how I teach classes. We jump around from image to image because we're talking about that snail body. So I usually never finish an image. We actually jump from thing to thing, learning a technique. This is what it looks like. All right, so then we're going to do a snail body again. So he's got, again, a round head, a sphere, a ball. So we're going to come up from underneath and create this round shape. I'm trying to think if I've got a piece of scratch paper that I can show you guys. I do. So the biggest mistake you can do on a round shape is do the shading completely from one side over. And that doesn't matter if it's underneath, if it's at the top, look, he's got hair, or it's from side to side. When you cut it down the center in half, it's going to flatten it. Okay. When I have a ball or a sphere, the highlight hits somewhere on that sphere in the shape of the object, in that ball shape. So it could hit at the edge, but again, it's going to be round. So when I'm shading, it actually has to work all the way around the edge, coming into that highlight, right? And that's what's going to make your object look round and coming out of your image, not where your light source is. Has nothing to do with that, really. It has to do with creating that ball-like shape. So that is what we're going for. Okay. See, you guys are getting all sorts of info today. E50. Now, E50 is one that if I go over those little black spots, and I'm going to, they might bleed a little bit, even if they've been sitting for a really long time. E50 is a really light color. It's got a lot of alcohol in the mix, that alcohol solution that's in Copic markers, which we use to our advantage and do all sorts of fun things with these lighter markers, but it will kind of smush your ink, your stamping ink around, even when it is Copic compatible. Now, what happens, and this is not from this time, but you can see the tip of my marker has a little bit of gray on it. That is not affecting the ink flow at all. Sometimes it'll pick up from one of these, but it will not affect the ink flow. If it bothers you, you can always change the nib. Carla loves the accessories. I'm glad you like. Thanks. Then E5-3, we're going to make this guy round, right? So we want to come in. We're going to say that highlight's kind of hitting them right smack dab in the middle there. And we're going to come in and create that round highlight. His lip flares back out, and that outer edge is probably going to catch light a little bit. So, but see how we've left that round, and we're going to come up and around just a little bit. His little eye doodads. And then he's got, again, this kind of cylinder neck down into his body. You are welcome, Kim. So this time, because it's being lit from above, the highlight that we're going to see from where we're sitting looking at him is going to kind of come down right down the center. So we're going to shade a little bit from both sides. And then because it curls then under and back, it'll also come from the ground up. And that's part of this. We have that basic shape, but now we've manipulated it. We've curved it around. Now my guess is, because he's got his little lip flaring out, we can add a little bit of a cast shadow underneath. And then back behind, we can come up. Now this is where you get debatable. You could say that that back, where it curls back into the shell, is a little bit light. You could also say that the shell kind of flares up and over that section so it gets dark. I'm going to leave that one up to you. You can argue till you're blue in the face, and I'm going to say you're right, whichever way you argue. So, your choice. Artistic license, you've got it. So E5-5, smaller amounts, same places. Again, we're reinforcing the shape of this guy. So coming in, it doesn't necessarily go all the way across. Doesn't go all the way across the top of his head. But that's going to reinforce that round shape. Definitely coming in, maybe right up under the lip. I'm sure a snail's little mouth that's his lip, I'm sure. With animals, I always call it like the human parts, and I know they've all got different names when this isn't even really an animal. But it's his lip, right? You'll buy into that. Okay. We know it's going to get dark from down below. And dark at the very bottom of his little tail, but it catches light on the top. We're going to hit reverse, find that E5-3. So I'm not talking much about how I'm blending, but when I go light to dark and then hit reverse, most of the time what I do, and this is different for every Copic artist out there, is I kind of hit the edge of that darker color and then pull. So I kind of circle a little bit right on the edge of my darker color, and then I pull it into that mid-tone area. And because it's been sitting there, by circling on that edge a little bit, it kind of re-wets it and gets the ink moving again. And that mid-tone might come out a little further. I'm okay with that. I know when I blend this way, that's bound to happen. And yes, I color fast. People comment on that, but I've been doing this for a really long time. And it's what I do. I spend a lot of time coloring with Copics. And when I get to my lightest color, I have to go all the way across that highlight area. I can't just do that edge. I definitely hit the edge because I want to soften it and kind of push back in, but then I want to go all the way across, at least one time re-wetting that area. If I don't, I end up with a watermark, kind of that edge where you see the wet and dry hitting. And so you want to make sure to go all the way across your highlight area. Okay. So what I did on the little snails is I just use the darkest version of their skin tone to come back and hit their spots. So when you're ready, whichever tones you used on these little guys, I just came back in and made them the darkest of them. So on this guy, it's the E55. And I don't know if you can see this. He has a little bit of a greenish tone to him. And that's because I got to that E55. And you remember how I talked about that? And I went back and blended it. And so it's starting to get that little bit of a greenish tint out in that area. Then E97, and this is still pretty light. It probably would do better to go back and do something even darker, but I could hit it 2 or 3 times with E97 and get those darker if I want. All right. Then we've got the shells. So we're going to do this one first, a little bit easier because it's in profile. And then we'll switch and do the other one. So this guy is the E7s. And what we've got going, this is a cylinder. So it's the tube shape, but we've curled it all the way around. So what I'm going to do, because I want you guys to be able to see this really, really well, is this time I'm going to go from dark to light. There's no magic nature to go from light to dark or dark to light. Some people see things better one way or the other. When I teach basic Copic or beginner Copic classes, I always teach light to dark. And the reason is when you really wet the whole paper first, people tend to have an easier time blending the color. But working dark to light, sometimes people see how to shade objects better. So it's helpful to learn both ways or experiment with both ways. But the shading is going to go in the same place. So this is a tube. It's wrapping around and around and around, but I want to make it look like a tube. So the rule on a cylinder, so let's look at our marker. You can see how it's catching light. It catches on the length of the body. It goes down the length of the tube. If I turn it sideways, it doesn't switch and suddenly get darker at one end and lighter on the other end. The highlight, I'll tip it so you guys can see it better. The highlight still happens the length of the cylinder. It runs the length always. It's how it works. It's never going to be this half and this half. It's never going to go darker to lighter. The highlight is going to run the length of the cylinder and it will get darker as you move away from it. So on the shells, it's one long cylinder. So the highlight will literally run the full length of the cylinder. So where's the highlight? Just for giggle's sake, you do not need to do this. Don't do this, in fact, because I'll probably forget and make a mistake here. If my light is mostly coming from up above, which is what we really did, we can kind of ignore that. The highlight is going to run along the top of the cylinder, right? Along the top. But then if I keep going right here, look, now it's suddenly on the bottom of the cylinder. It's actually going to shift because now it's going to be the top edge of the cylinder as it curves around. Top edge of the cylinder. Top edge of the cylinder. I know, confusing, right? Top edge of the cylinder. Those pencil lines are where the highlight, the lightest part of the shell, are going to be. So I'm going to ignore those for a second. The deepest part of the shadow is going to be opposite of the highlight, right? Where it gets darkest, so where it wraps in and tucks in away from the light. So my darkest color that I'm going to use this time is an E74. And I'm not going to do all the shell right away. Let's do the parts we can see where that highlight is. It's going to come right around here. But then look, it's bumping up against that highlight, so it's got to change, right? Now, It's coming from the bottom of the cylinder again, because the cylinder moved on us. The bottom of the cylinder. The bottom of the cylinder. So every place that I put that E74 is exactly opposite of a pencil line. That's where my shadow happens. That's where the darkest part of this shell happens. And it's going to help us show the viewer that it's that curly, but it's also that rounded cylinder shape that tucks in those creases. Okay, I am going to erase my pencil lines. This is like a horrible eraser. Why did I do that? Okay, don't use that, Michelle. Okay, hopefully this one, not bad. Okay. So I'm grabbing the E74 one more time. It's going to come up from this bottom little spot just a touch. And really I can come back and add more, but this is where I want those darkest spots. Okay, E71. I'm going to start in the E74. I'm going to go a little further. I want to soften that edge so it kind of melts away, but I'm leaving white. Same thing, soften that edge, pulls into that white, but I'm leaving some. Soften that edge, pull into that white. I sound like a broken record. Yes, I know. But a lot of artistic practice and a lot of artistic pursuits are repetition. It's repeating a similar process. And then I have my E70. It will start in the mid-tone, that E71, and it'll go to the edge. Now, for those people that have adopted and do almost all their coloring from dark to light, this is one of their favorite things about this, is that when they get to this step, they're basically, if they've done their job well, and sometimes they have to go back, but a lot of times they're just done. They don't have to go back and do more blending. They're finished. So not only are you using less ink, and your markers sometimes will last a little longer, but it's quicker. And so they like that aspect of it. Now, I did not come in here, get this little round spot in there. So I'm going to come in and hit that. And then I'm going to go right against those edges with my E74 again. Sometimes, as I blend, even going dark to light, I lose some of that darkest, deepest color. So hitting it a second time, right along that edge, helps really push that in. I'm a contrast girl. I like to show that contrast between the light and dark. So I'm just barely, because this is all really wet, I'm barely touching it with my mid-tone and it just melts. I don't have to scrub, nothing, just touch it. And I have a swirly snail shell. Thank you, Carla. Oh, Jennifer, you don't need to worry about that at all. I'm glad you're here. So this, though, gives me that appearance of that cylinder kind of wrapping itself around. And it's really just that mind game of as it turns and wraps, I have to remember that that highlight still stays to the one edge, the top edge, top meaning from above, that top edge of the cylinder. So it shifts. It does move because we've curved our cylinder. So the trick is, it's nice and kind of in profile. What happens then when we turn him sat kind of at this funny angle, and we can still see the swirl, but we don't get, it's not as clear. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to grab my pencil so you guys can kind of see what I'm aiming for. So this is still that cylinder, but now we see it wrapping around both directions. So this top edge right here is going to be the highlight because it goes up and over his body, right? So that's going to be the light on this top big portion. And then it'll be light at the top, light at the top. But then as it comes around, right, it's going to get, remember, it's going to curve under and get light at the top of the cylinder again, at the top of the cylinder again. So it's the exact same shading as what we did over here. It's just been kind of tipped and turned. The biggest difference is this top portion that's coming up and away from the viewer behind him. So we want to show that it's curving off in both sides. Thank you, Kim and Carla. And on this one, I'm using the E8s, which has that mossy green, and I got it quite a bit darker. I'm actually only using 2 of the E8s. I've got an E87 and an E84. So E87, let's find, we're going to come from that line and work toward, that's a hard word to say, that highlight that comes up and over. And we'll do a little bit coming barely off this edge, coming from that side as well, coming up toward the highlight. Up toward the highlight. There's the underside up toward the highlight. Up toward the highlight. And then we'll have these extra little pieces down here. And really, truly, some of this is, again, your interpretation. You guys get to play around with some of these areas because it's not clear. He's a cartoon. We can kind of play with that a little bit about what shape that really is. I did not even use a photograph to draw these guys, which is unusual for me. So completely unrealistic. All right. Before I hit my highlight areas, I am going to erase my pencil lines so I don't trap them underneath my Copic. I think sometimes that's helpful for you guys to see what I am aiming for, though. But I don't want to color Copic on top of them or they will be stuck there. Okay, E84, same deal as before. We're going to kind of come in, soften those edges, and then this one actually fills that area in because I don't have a third color. So softening up the edge of the E84 or E87 and then coming up and over the top. Now there is an E81 that is a beautiful highlight color. If I remember correctly, at the time when I took it to go do my coloring, I was away from my desk and it turned out the E81 was basically dry. So this little guy got done without a third color, but I think it turned out okay. So just 2 on this guy's shell. And what I try to do when I don't have kind of that third one, so I try to make that last little white area, sorry, he's got to go upside down, more of a single pass. Kind of do it as lightly as possible. So it does still end up a little bit lighter than that heavier coloring and blending that I'm doing at the edge. And I'll do the same thing on this one if I need to. I can go back in and darken up. I want to show you a trick though on this one as well. So I'm going to come back in with my E87, punch some of those. Look how dark and rich that one gets when I punch that back just a little bit more. Just by adding that second layer of that E87 makes such a huge difference. This up and over just a little bit more. And just barely on this edge. I think that'll, there we go. All right. All right, so yes, I am a fan of both unrealistic and realistic, and what I find is that I try to use some of the realistic concepts on unrealistic objects. So even though this is a very unrealistic shell and snail, just that idea of still making that cylinder and that shape happen, that's the fun part to me. All right, so we've got all these little pieces, and then he's got his mailbag. And the mailbag, when I did this, was designed that it fits on the back of this guy, but if you wanted to, you could actually also sling it kind of around the front of this guy. So you guys can play around with that a bit. Let's see. And what I did on that is I just used, I think I just used 2 colors. So I have an E04, which is this really odd color, and I use it a ton. It's this kind of dusty rose. What's it even called? Lipstick Natural. So if you're a person who does a lot of figures that are a little bit larger and that have mouths that are big enough to color, this is one of my absolute go-to favorite lip colors because it's still very much a skin tone, but a little bit rosier. So to me, it actually does look like lip. And then I've got E07, and this is where we start to get into those reds. And my goal with this one was to kind of make it look a little bit like worn leather. So I kind of came across the front and didn't necessarily, I'm not trying to get like a shape so much as kind of mottled or blotch. And then from underneath the flap and kind of along the bottom edge of the straps. Back to E04. Smush that around. The interesting part to me about the E04, I have blended it also with an E09. and they really actually melt together, even though that color is pretty extreme. I love how much it kind of just smushes and melts. It's one that does that extremely easily. Now I'm going to grab my colorless blender and I'm going to go in and kind of smush that around a little bit more. And I'm not going all the way to the edge because that'll push it right off of the bag, but I'm going to go right into the center and kind of push that color around, and it'll make it look a little bit mottled. And to me, it looks like worn leather. All right. I want to give you one option on the snail shell before we move on to the scene. And the scene is really easy. So that part will be quick. Yes, I've stepped away from my phone. Sorry. Where did it go? Oh, good grief. There it is. So on your shell, if it got too dark, what I would actually recommend is using a lighter version of this color to lighten that versus the colorless blender. You can do that, but you're going to be happier with it if you use a lighter either earth tone. And in this case, we can actually use the lightest of the E8s because I have rejuiced it. So if it got too dark, I can come back in with that E8 1 and push that highlight out a little bit. So start right where you want that highlight to be lighter and kind of push out. I can do the same thing on the shell itself. So if it got a little dingy looking and a little muddy, you can absolutely do a little bit of work. Now, if it's completely dry, you're going to give yourself some watermarks unless you do more blending, more kind of coming back in with some of those colors. So be ready to do some more back and forth, but you can lighten up an image if you don't get kind of exactly what you want to start with. All right, tuck these little guys off to the side for a second. The card itself is a slimline card that I did. So this is like a full card front, so I don't need this entire thing colored. In fact, it's about a 1/2 inch smaller. So what I did is I literally used 3 markers. I have a B quadruple 0, a G 4-3, and that BV 2-3. And then I did use a little bit of the colorless blender, and that is it. So I think it's easier if you're going to do this to start with your ground. And I use the broad nib. And I just start and create kind of whatever my horizon line. And all I'm doing is just these little short choppy up and down. And then I'm going to come back in and I'm going to randomly fill that in. And this part does take a while. Thanks, Carla. They fit really well on a slim line. And I don't know that I really kind of thought that through, but I thought it'd be fun to do both of the snails in the tutorial. And I was like, oh, I bet they will sit on there just right. And they did. It's always fun when something works the way you want it to. Now, when I am doing kind of a grassy area, you can kind of see what I'm doing. I'm doing these horizontal kind of waves back and forth. I try not to just go straight across. I try to kind of break it up, and we've got these other little hills that kind of come in. Some get a little bit, some of those little zigzags get a little taller, some get a little shorter. They are overlapping, but if you can see what's happening, where the 2 rows kind of bump into each other, it gets a little darker. We've got more ink in those sections. And so it's already looking kind of like a textured ground, and that's kind of the point. So and this is definitely kind of the speedy, quick scenery. This is about as simple as it comes. You can always do way more complicated, but this is just simple, simple. So I'm going to let that sit for a second. Coming back to it, don't worry. And I'm going to flip and aim for my sky. Now again, I'm going to open the broad nib or the chisel nib, whichever one you call it. It's actually a medium broad nib if you're ever looking to replace it. And I'm going to fill in the sky, but I decided I'd leave some clouds. So typically when I'm doing a sky, I do kind of a circular stroke. And the only reason for that, it has nothing to do, it's just, it coats the area really well. And I've left some white. The B quadruple 0 is a really, really light marker. So this might be a little bit hard for you guys to see on the video. It's noisy though, when you do the circles. But what happens with circling is that I hit areas a couple times right away. I'm not having to go back and forth. I usually go over an area a couple times with circles, but then it's pretty good. But I'm leaving these funny little blobs of white. And the fun part about adding clouds is that every time you do it, they can be a different shape. And if the rest of the sky is not perfectly smooth, it just kind of looks like wispy clouds. So there's some big benefits to adding clouds versus trying to get that perfectly smooth blue sky. Now, one thing I do with clouds though is I pretty much always, I need to set that guy aside to be refilled. I pretty much always come back with my colorless blender and I hit the edge. I'm not trying to fade it to white necessarily. I'm just trying to soften it because sometimes it's a little bit crisper. Now with a quadruple 0, it's kind of doing the job for us. If you had a darker blue, this would be a more important step. But I usually hit those edges, but can you see how it just kind of looks fluffy? That part makes it easy. And so to me, those clouds could be anywhere. I try to make them random so they're not like bump, 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 bump. It's not like precise. Very random shapes, kind of random placement. One might be falling off the edge. That's up to you. So 2 more steps and we'd be ready to put the card together. I'm going to grab my same green again, the G43, and this time I'm going to open the brush nib, which is dirty. And I'm going to go into some of these little spots that are already a little darker. And I'm going to add some more. Little zigzags up and down, a few little random stragglers, little patches. Even in our lawns, when we look out, usually, now you know there's that lawn down the street that has like perfect grass that never has the little taller pieces that are mixed seed and all that stuff, but most of us, not so much. But we want to break it up. And that's the goal with this. We're just breaking it up again. All right. And that's kind of it. These snails are going to get cut out. And they're going to sit on here. So I'm not going to cut them out, ladies. I'm not going to do that tonight. Finish this all the way up. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut them out later. And then they'll sit on top of this grass. And when I have figured out where they're going to sit, that's when this blue violet comes into play. I'm literally going to figure out, okay, he's going to sit right here to here. And if I need to, I can give it like a little tick with a pencil really lightly. Now notice this is really dark. And you're going, oh my gosh, Michelle, that's way too dark. So here's the problem. Sometimes the ones I want to use are too light, and then the next step up is too dark. If I do this, then come back with my green, watch what happens. I've got this great cast shadow. So not only am I adding quite a bit more of that green ink, but this little guy is going to sit right on top of there. He's got a perfect little cast shadow. I would do the same thing over here for this guy. Now it's got to go at an angle. So again, if it makes it easier, kind of give yourself that little kind of cue with a pencil where it's going to kind of sit and kind of come around the front of him and underneath him. And I'll show you what it looks like on my other card so you guys can see. But what happens, so the G43 is actually has a little more alcohol in it than the BV23. So it really dissipates that. It softens it. It pushes it through a little bit and pushes it out. But it really just, it works really well. Okay, so this is what the scene looks like. These guys get cut out and put on. Here we go. Ta-da! Magic. So I trimmed my scene, 1/2 inch down total. I put a little piece of craft cardstock behind it. And then my snails got popped up, and it's 2 layers on this guy. So there's a layer underneath the snail, and then I put a single square right underneath the bag, and then glued the straps down to the snail shell. So it comes up and back down. So this is a double foam kind of right there. But just the bag is kind of popped up thicker, and then the strap actually attaches back to the snail. But can you see how those shadows, now because it's foam kind of popped up, then you've got a little bit of cast shadow from my window that's happening as well. I'll turn it so you guys can maybe see it better. But you can see that light blue violet, there you go, a little better, under both of those guys. That's creating the appearance of a cast shadow, and now we have a cast shadow because of the light above them, but that gives you the idea of how that is working. Thank you, Kim. So really simple scene. I feel like sometimes those are the best because then we focus on the snails that we've spent all the time on. We can do more complicated scenes, but I thought it might be worth talking about shape and form and a little mini lesson on the earth tones today, so you guys get some more Copic information. So as always, if you've got more questions for me, if you're coming in, I know we didn't have a whole bunch of people here, and that is just fine. When you're watching this in replay, if you have questions about this or any Copic questions, just put my name in there, kind of tag me so I find it, and then I will get back to you. And if you have requests for types of scenes or things that you would like to see colored, just let me know. I always love a little input on that so we can focus it in on things you guys would like to learn. Thank you, Kim and Carla. It's always fun to have you guys here visiting, and I really always appreciate it. All right, I think we are there. You guys have a really good evening and afternoon. I'm afternoon. It's only 4 p.m. here, so I have the rest of the day. But you guys have a good evening wherever you're at, and I will see you next time. Have a good one.